Chapter 4. The Clown in the Woods. It happened when I was 12 years old, an age where I had just enough awareness of my surroundings to sense danger, yet still young enough to attract the kind of attention that haunts your nightmares. We lived in a relatively busy neighborhood, though our block was a dead end, bordered by a dense forest preserve. Across the street there was an old, unused sump, a foreboding place that only added to the eerie isolation. If you walked through the forest, you would find yourself in a small community park, quiet during the day, but that night, it was buzzing with life. It was a Saturday night, and the park was hosting a mini carnival. Since I had nothing to do and no plans with friends, my mom suggested I check it out. She wasn't the kind of mom to be overprotective or to tell me I couldn't go out after dark. She trusted me, and I had always appreciated that freedom. With her blessing, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods. It wasn't a long walk, just a half-mile through trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The path, familiar by day, felt different under the cover of night. The shadows were deeper, the rustling of leaves more ominous. But as I emerged from the forest and crossed through the fence that separated the woods from the park, the sounds of laughter and carnival music washed away my unease. The carnival lights dazzled against the dark backdrop of night. Ferris wheels spun lazily, a mini roller coaster clattered along its track, and concession stands lined the walkways, filling the air with the smell of fried dough and cotton candy. Despite the lively atmosphere, it wasn't too crowded. It was late, and most families had already gone home. At the center of it all was a large red and white striped circus tent. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. There were only a handful of people seated in the small audience, and on stage were 3 clowns. One was riding a tricycle in tight circles, another juggling brightly colored balls, and the last clown was just dancing in a way that felt oddly unsettling, as if he was playing a joke only he understood. As I watched, the dancing clown turned toward me. His painted grin seemed to stretch wider when he spotted me peeking inside the tent. Without a word, he started skipping toward me, his movements unnaturally quick. He raised a gloved hand and crooked his index finger, motioning for me to come closer. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. I pulled back from the tent and disappeared into the carnival crowd, my heart racing. I found a friend at one of the game booths, and for a while I tried to forget about the clown, convincing myself it was all in good fun. But as the night wore on and the carnival began to shut down, a creeping sense of dread returned. I said goodbye to my friend and made my way back toward the woods. As I neared the fence, I heard a voice. "Hey, kid," it called out from behind me. I froze. It was him, the clown, the same one who had waved me over in the tent. He was standing there just a few feet behind me, the flickering carnival lights casting long shadows across his painted face. "Want to see the backstage? The real fun stuff? The things the guests never get to see?" His voice was cheerful, almost sing-song, but something about it was horribly wrong. I shook my head quickly, muttering a quiet, "No thanks," before turning and heading for the woods. I glanced over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following. He wasn't, at least not yet. He just stood there watching me, his painted smile frozen in place. The way he stared made my skin crawl, and as soon as I was out of sight, I started running, my flashlight bouncing wildly with each step. I told myself it was over, that he wouldn't follow me into the woods. But the feeling of being watched gnawed at me, and I kept turning around expecting to see him behind me. 3/4 of the way through the woods, I heard it again. The same voice, this time closer, too close. "Hey, kid!" I spun around, and there he was, stepping out from the thick shadows between the trees. The light from my flashlight caught the white of his face, his wide, artificial smile cutting through the darkness. My stomach churned with fear, and my legs felt like they'd turned to stone. He was walking toward me, slow but deliberate. My mind raced. I had no plan. Without thinking, I hurled my flashlight at him and bolted. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me, matching the rhythm of my own terrified heartbeat. He was getting closer, and the thought of his painted face and those dead eyes searing into me from behind was enough to make me run even faster. The trees thinned, and I saw the road up ahead. I didn't stop running until my feet hit pavement, and even then, I didn't dare look back. The footsteps behind me had stopped, and I could feel the weight of his gaze lifting as I crossed into the safety of the street. Only then did I turn around, and through the trees I saw him, just standing there at the edge of the woods. He didn't follow me onto the road. He just watched. When I got home, I collapsed inside, gasping for breath like I'd just finished a marathon. My mom, concerned, asked what had happened, but I couldn't tell her the truth. I didn't want her to stop letting me go out on my own, so I lied. "I just jogged the whole way back," I said with a forced smile. She accepted the answer, and it was never brought up again. But to this day, whenever I walk by those woods, I feel like someone, or something, is still watching from the shadows, waiting for me to make the mistake of going back in. Satr, the Silent Clown. Up until the age of 14, I always had an irrational fear of clowns. It all started when I was 5, at a county fair on a cold Tuesday night in November. I was walking with my parents when a clown suddenly appeared, leering at me with its garish makeup and exaggerated features. That night, something deep inside me snapped. From that moment on, clowns were no longer symbols of laughter. They were something far more sinister. When I was 14, my parents went on vacation, leaving me alone for the night. My sister and brother were also out, so I called my friend B to see if he wanted to hang out. It was break, and the local fair had set up a few blocks away in an empty parking lot. We decided to walk over and check it out. The fair was small but lively, with brightly colored lights illuminating the cold night. Carnival rides groaned and squeaked as they spun, and the smell of fried food hung heavy in the air. B and I wandered around, playing a few games, but something about the place felt off. There was an uneasy stillness in the air, like the calm before a storm. That's when we saw him. A clown standing near one of the game booths. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. His mouth stretched wide in a grotesque grin, his eyes unnervingly still. He moved like a mime, making exaggerated hand motions and bopping around in a slow, deliberate way. The closer he got, the more uncomfortable I became. "He's more creepy than weird," I muttered to B. "Yeah, let's get out of here," B said. We left quickly, trying to laugh it off, but the eerie presence of that clown clung to me. We walked in silence, heading back to my house, the quiet of the neighborhood streets making the footsteps of our own shoes seem louder than they should have been. Then we heard it, a pair of footsteps, not ours. We turned around, but the street was empty. No one was there. B was starting to freak out, and I'll admit I wasn't far behind. But I convinced him to stay and hang out at my place instead of going home. We kept walking, but the footsteps continued, always just behind us. There was a feeling, a heavy weight pressing down, like we were being hunted. Finally, we made it to my house. I fumbled through my pockets, my hands trembling as I searched for the key. B suddenly nudged me and I froze. "Turn around," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned slowly, and my blood ran cold. There, crouched behind the bushes next door, was the clown. His painted face peeked through the leaves, his eyes wide, staring at us. He didn't blink, didn't move, until he saw that we had spotted him. Then, he stood up. Without hesitation, he started walking toward us, his silent footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. I panicked. My fingers fumbled with the keys, trying to find the right one, as the clown got closer and closer. B was practically shaking beside me. Finally, I found the right key. I shoved it into the lock, twisted it and flung the door open. We dove inside, slamming the door behind us just as the clown reached the front steps. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. I called my parents immediately, my voice shaking as I told them about the clown. They told us to arm ourselves and hide upstairs until they got home. Grabbing a kitchen knife, B and I ran up to my little brother's room, locking the door behind us. We peeked through the blinds, and there he was. The clown stood in the middle of our driveway, staring up at the window. His face was hidden in shadow, but his painted grin seemed to glow in the moonlight. He stood perfectly still like a mannequin. His eyes locked onto the window, waiting, watching. I shut the blinds, and we ducked down, breathing heavily, our hearts racing in sync with the terror we felt. For the next 10 minutes, we waited in silence, listening for any sign of movement outside. But eventually, the sound of footsteps faded, and when we dared to peek out again, the clown was gone. At least we thought he was gone. For all we knew, he could have been hiding somewhere on the property, waiting for another chance. We didn't sleep that night, too afraid to let our guard down. That clown wasn't like the others. He didn't want to entertain or make people laugh. He wanted something else, something darker. And as much as I tried to forget about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The summer after that encounter was uneventful at first. I spent most of it working at the local lumber yard, loading lumber into trucks. The routine was mindless, but it kept me busy, and I liked the fact that my house was just a mile away. I'd walk home every night, the peace and quiet of our small town lulling me into a sense of security. But as the days shortened and the shadows lengthened, I began to feel uneasy again. It was late one evening, around 9:30 p.m., when I started my usual walk home from the lumber yard. The sun had set, leaving only the faint glow of the moon to light the narrow road ahead. The thick rows of trees on either side of the road seemed to press in, and the sound of crickets filled the air like a constant rhythmic hum. I was halfway home when I heard it, a high-pitched, cackling laugh. I stopped dead in my tracks, pulling out my earbuds. The sound didn't belong. It was out of place, too sharp and too close. I stood there listening, straining to hear over the chorus of frogs and crickets. But all I heard was silence. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the wind or an animal in the woods. I continued walking, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The next day, I started my shift as usual, but I couldn't shake the memory of that laugh. Something was out there, and whatever it was watching me, and that was only the beginning. The clown's nose. It was just another normal day. At least, that's how it started. I was 14, working a summer job at the local lumber yard. The work was simple and kept me busy, and my house was exactly 1 mile away. Walking to and from work had become a daily routine, one I didn't think much about. On this particular day, I started my shift at 2 p.m., which meant I left for work around 1:30. It was a beautiful day, the kind that makes you forget the lurking darkness the night can bring. I kicked a rock along the road, watching it skip across the pavement. As it bounced one last time, it rolled next to something unusual lying in the dirt. Curious, I walked over and picked it up. It was bright red, round, and soft to the touch. I gave it a little squeeze, and it squeaked, a clown's nose. "What the hell is this doing out here?" I mumbled to myself, glancing around at the empty road. There were no houses nearby, no fares in town, nothing that could explain why a clown nose would be sitting out in the middle of nowhere. I shrugged, pocketing the nose to show the guys at work. When I got to the lumber yard, I put it on and gave it a few honks, drawing some laughs. For the rest of the day, the thought of that nose lingered in the back of my mind, like a nagging itch I couldn't quite scratch. The day passed without incident, and by 9:30 p.m., I clocked out for the night. Unfortunately, I'd forgotten my earbuds at home, which meant no music to accompany my walk back. It was just me and the quiet, the sound of my footsteps on the pavement the only thing keeping me company. The road was deserted, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ground. As I walked, I noticed something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road, about 150 yards ahead. Squinting, I could just make out the shape. At first I thought it was a deer, standing still in the fog that had started to roll in, but something about it felt off. I got closer, and the figure bolted into the woods. I breathed a sigh of relief, assuming it had been spooked by my presence. But as I passed the spot where the figure had been standing, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Human footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Before I could turn to look, I heard a voice. "Hey there." I froze. Slowly, I turned my head to see a clown standing in the middle of the road, about 20 yards behind me. His costume was dirty, stained beyond recognition. His makeup was smeared, his eyes black pits beneath the smeared paint. He stood perfectly still, his hands hidden behind his back, but his gaze never left mine. "You have something of mine," he said, his voice unnervingly cheerful. "I need it back." A chill ran down my spine as I realized what he meant. I had his nose, the red ball I'd found earlier. I stammered, I don't have anything of yours," and started to back away, my house still a quarter-mile down the road. The clown tilted his head to the side and his grin widened. "Well then," he said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper, "if you don't have my nose, I'm gonna need yours." He pulled something from behind his back, a long, gleaming machete. My heart stopped. Before I could think, I turned and ran, sprinting down the road as fast as my legs could carry me. Behind me, I heard the soft, rapid slap of his bare feet hitting the pavement, followed by the scraping sound of metal blades dragging along the road. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my lungs burning with every breath. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps behind me kept getting louder, closer, and then I heard it, a high-pitched giggle, a sound that sent adrenaline coursing through my veins, pushing me forward even faster. I could hear him right behind me, his breath hot on the back of my neck. My house was still too far away, and I was running out of energy. I didn't dare look back, knowing that even a second of hesitation could be the end. Just as my legs were about to give out, headlights appeared at the top of the hill. A truck. I waved my arms frantically, praying the driver would see me. The truck screeched to a stop just in front of me, its lights illuminating the road. I glanced behind me, expecting to see the clown lunging toward me, machetes in hand. But there was nothing. The road was empty. The clown had vanished, as if he had never been there at all. I ran to the truck, breathless, and told the driver what had happened. He called the police, but there was nothing they could do. No sign of the clown, no tracks, no evidence that he had ever been there. It was as if he had melted into the night. That was the last time I ever walked home in the dark. I still don't know how the clown got to that stretch of road, or why he waited for me. There are no houses nearby, no cars that could have dropped him off. It doesn't make sense. And the worst part? I'm not the only one. Lately, there have been more reports. Clowns hiding in the woods, stalking people in the dead of night. Some say it's a cult. Others think it's just a sick joke, a group of deranged individuals with nothing better to do. All I know is I'll never be able to walk alone at night again. And clowns? I'll never look at them the same way. The second encounter. The first time I encountered the clown, I told myself it was a fluke, a nightmare that would fade away. But sometimes, nightmares have a way of creeping back when you least expect them. It was late fall, weeks after the first incident. The trees were shedding their last few leaves, and the air was crisp, cold enough to bite through my jacket on the walk home from work. My shift at the lumber yard had run late, and by the time I clocked out, the sky had turned to a deep, inky black. I hadn't forgotten that night, the night with the clown, but I told myself it couldn't happen again. It was just a freak encounter, something from a bad dream. I took the same road home, as I always did. It was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl hidden somewhere in the trees. The moon, half covered by clouds, offered little light. I was more on edge than usual, every rustle of the trees making me snap my head around. About halfway home, I noticed something ahead on the road. Something small, lying in the middle of the pavement, like a discarded piece of trash. As I got closer, my heart began to race. It was the clown nose, the same one I had found before, bright red, sitting perfectly in the middle of the road as if it had been placed there, waiting for me. My breath caught in my throat. How? I had thrown the thing away after the first incident, hoping to forget it ever existed. Now it was here again, as if it had followed me. My hands trembled as I reached down to pick it up, my mind screaming at me to leave it and run. But I couldn't help myself. I squeezed it, and it squeaked. The same obnoxious, high-pitched sound from before. That's when I heard it. A laugh. Quiet at first, like a breeze blowing through the trees. Then louder, growing closer, until it filled the air around me. It was the same laugh from that night, the same one that had chased me down the road. I looked up, and there, standing just inside the tree line, was the clown. He was watching me, his head tilted to the side like before, his blackened eyes wide and unblinking. His clothes were more tattered now, streaked with grime and mud, the once vibrant colors barely visible beneath the filth. His makeup had smeared even more, giving his face the appearance of a cracked mask. He took a step forward, his bare feet crunching the dry leaves beneath him. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The clown stepped closer, emerging from the shadows of the trees, his eyes locked onto mine. His smile was wider now, more grotesque, splitting his face in two like a twisted caricature of joy. "You took something from me," he said, his voice low and sing-song, like a child playing a game. "You shouldn't have." He raised his hand, and in it, he held something that made my blood run cold. It was a long, jagged knife, gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The blade looked dull, rusted, like it had been used too many times before. Without another word, the clown started walking toward me, his steps slow, deliberate. I backed away, stumbling over my feet as panic clawed at my chest. My house was still too far away, and I didn't have the luxury of a passing truck to save me this time. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear the clown's footsteps quickening, the sound of his knife scraping against the road like nails on a chalkboard. Every few steps, I dared to glance back, hoping, praying, that he would be gone. But he wasn't. He was still there, his smile never wavering, his dark eyes following my every move. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, my house nothing more than a distant hope. And all the while, that laugh echoed behind me, growing louder and louder until it filled my head, drowning out everything else. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my leg, a searing, white-hot sensation that brought me crashing to the ground. I hit the pavement hard, scraping my hands and knees. I looked down and saw a thin, bloody line across my calf. The clown had thrown his knife. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain, and hobbled forward, desperation driving me. I could feel his presence behind me, so close that I could almost hear his breathing, feel his twisted smile boring into the back of my skull. My house came into view, its outline barely visible through the darkness. I pushed myself harder, knowing that if I slowed down, even for a second, I wouldn't make it. With one last burst of energy, I threw myself at the front door, slamming into it and fumbling for my keys. My hands shook so violently that I dropped them. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. Slowly, I turned around. The clown stood at the edge of my driveway, his head still tilted, his smile as wide as ever. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at me, his eyes glinting in the pale moonlight. For a moment, we stood there, locked in some twisted standoff. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the shadows as if he had never been there at all. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Finally, I picked up my keys and unlocked the door, collapsing inside. The police came again, but just like before, they found nothing. No tracks, no evidence of a struggle, nothing to prove that the clown had ever been there. But I know what I saw, and I know that he'll be back. I still find things sometimes. Small, innocuous objects left outside my house, a balloon tied to my mailbox, a squeaky toy in my driveway. Little reminders that he's still watching, waiting. I don't walk alone at night anymore. I don't take any chances. Because I know that one day, he'll come back for what he really wants.